My hands trembled slightly as I straightened my navy blazer, standing outside the gleaming glass headquarters of Vertex Innovations. The Seattle skyline stretched behind the building, the Space Needle barely visible through the morning mist. In my briefcase lay the documents that would change everything, the final acquisition papers that would make me the new CEO of the company where my former college classmate Ethan Morgan had spent the last 7 years mocking my quaint little side project. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I could still hear his booming voice from last night's industry gala. Emily's just playing shop while the rest of us build empires. His laughter had echoed across the ballroom, champagne sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his crystal flute. Homemade candles and artisanal soaps? That's not a real business. That's a hobby for housewives and retirees. Little did he know that my hobby had become Authentica Brands, a holding company that had quietly acquired 17 sustainable product manufacturers across the country. And today, we were completing our largest acquisition yet, Vertex Innovations, where Ethan served as Chief Marketing Officer. In less than an hour, he would discover that his new boss was the woman whose business ambitions he'd been ridiculing for years. I'd been waiting for this moment for so long, the moment when Ethan Morgan would finally understand exactly who he'd been underestimating. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the lobby. It was Time Emily Hartwell. That's what it said on the brushed metal nameplate I'd placed on my desk at home. A gift to myself when I'd started Luminous Crafts 5 years ago. Just a small reminder that I was building something real, something tangible, even if it began with handmade soy candles sold at the Pike Place Farmers Market on weekends. The nameplate now sat in my apartment overlooking Lake Union, gathering dust. I hadn't needed that reminder in a long time. These days, my name appeared on acquisition documents, investment portfolios, and the discreet letterhead of Authentica Brands, the holding company that had grown far beyond those early morning market stalls. Seattle's October rain tapped gently against the windows of my penthouse as I reviewed the final documents for tomorrow's acquisition. My cat, Fitzgerald, curled contentedly at my feet while I meticulously checked each page, drinking the same chamomile tea my grandmother had taught me to brew when I was just a child. Some habits never change, even when everything else does. My phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca Mitchell, my COO and closest confidant since business school. Everything set for tomorrow? The legal team just sent the final green light. Smiled, typing back. All ready. Ethan doesn't suspect a thing. Rebecca's response was immediate. Still can't believe he invited you to that gala. Talk about walking into the lion's den without realizing you own the zoo. I set my phone down, remembering the embossed invitation that had arrived 3 weeks ago. The Emerging Technology Leaders Annual Gala, Seattle's most prestigious tech industry event. My invitation had come courtesy of Jason Reynolds, Vertex's founder and CEO, who was selling the company due to health concerns. He'd insisted I attend to get a feel for the company culture before finalizing the acquisition. What neither Jason nor anyone else at Vertex knew was that Ethan Morgan and I had history, stretching back to our days at Stanford Business School, where he'd been the golden boy everyone expected to change the world, and I was the quiet, methodical student he barely noticed unless it was to point out how my small thinking would keep me from ever making an impact. I still remembered his words during our final presentation in Advanced Entrepreneurship. Emily's business plan for artisanal home goods is quaint, but in today's digital economy, you either disrupt or disappear. Some people just don't think big enough. The professor had nodded along, everyone had chuckled, and I'd gone back to my notes, saying nothing. That was 12 years ago. Since then, I'd watched Ethan's meteoric rise through splashy tech startups and bold LinkedIn announcements. Meanwhile, I'd started small, exactly as I'd planned, building luminous crafts with sustainable materials, ethical production practices, and authentic connection to our customers. What Ethan never understood was that I wasn't thinking small, I was building something with a foundation. While he chased the next big disruption, I was creating something lasting. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. My assistant, Michael, stood there with several file folders. "The complete personnel files from Vertex that you requested," he said, placing them on my desk, "including the full organizational chart and performance reviews from the last 3 quarters. "Thank you, Michael. "And the background on the executive team?" He nodded. "All in the blue folder. I've highlighted the relevant details about Mr. Morgan, as requested." After Michael left, I opened the blue folder, finding myself face to face with Ethan's corporate headshot. The same confident smile, the same carefully tousled brown hair, just with subtle touches of gray at the temples now. His biography listed his impressive credentials. Harvard MBA, he'd transferred after our first year at Stanford. Former management consultant, early employee at 2 unicorn startups, and now CMO at Vertex Innovations, where he'd helped grow their market share by 35% in under 4 years. The performance reviews told a more complex story. Brilliant but difficult. Innovative but abrasive. Drives results but creates tension. Classic Ethan, always the smartest person in the room and never letting anyone forget it. I closed the folder and checked the time. The gala would begin in 3 hours. Tonight would be interesting. My last interaction with Ethan as a peer before tomorrow changed everything. My closet held the perfect weapon for such an occasion. A tailored black Valentino gown. Subtle, but unmistakably powerful. As I dressed, I thought about how appearances had always been part of Ethan's leverage over others. His tailored suits, his perfect haircuts, his carefully cultivated image of success. They were armor he used to intimidate and impress. My phone rang. It was Grace Thompson, my childhood friend who'd become my personal attorney when I started expanding beyond luminous crafts. "Just checking in before tonight," Grace said. "How are you feeling about seeing him again?" "Surprisingly calm," I replied, securing a pair of pearl earrings, another gift from my grandmother. "It's been a long road to get here. Just remember that tomorrow everything changes. Tonight you're still just Emily who makes candles as far as he knows. Don't give anything away." "Don't worry," I assured her. "I've kept this secret for 5 years. I can manage one more night." What Grace was referring to was the careful structure we'd created for Authentica Brands, a privately held holding company that made all its acquisitions through layers of LLCs and investment vehicles. My name appeared nowhere in public documents. To the business world, Authentica was a mysterious entity backed by private investors who valued sustainable, ethical business practices. In reality, it was just me, Emily Hartwell, reinvesting the profits from each successful acquisition into larger and larger companies, starting with Luminous Crafts, then adding a small soap manufacturer in Portland, then a textile company in Denver, gradually building a portfolio of businesses that shared my values while generating increasingly significant returns. The real irony was that Ethan himself had helped make this acquisition possible. His aggressive marketing campaigns had overextended Vertex, creating cash flow problems that made Jason Reynolds more willing to sell. Ethan had been pushing the company to grow faster than was sustainable. Exactly the kind of thinking that had always separated our approaches to business. As my car service arrived to take me to the Olympic Hotel where the gala was being held, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anticipation, certainly, and perhaps a touch of nervousness. But there was something else too, a sense of completion, of a circle finally closing after years of patient work. The Olympic Hotel's grand ballroom was transformed for the evening, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over Seattle's tech elite. Entrepreneurs, investors, and executives mingled over champagne and canapés, all celebrating another year of innovation and disruption. I spotted Ethan immediately. He stood in the center of a group of admiring listeners, gesturing emphatically as he spoke. Some things never change. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and made my way slowly through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with the few people I recognized from industry events. "Emily Hartwell? Is that you?" I turned to find Jason Reynolds approaching, his hand extended in greeting. At 65, he moved a bit more slowly than when I'd first met him 3 months ago to discuss the acquisition, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Jason, wonderful to see you," I said, taking his hand. "How are you feeling?" "Better than the doctors expected," he said with a wink. "But still ready to hand over the reins. Have you met any of the team yet? Besides me, of course?" "Not yet. I thought I'd circulate a bit first." "Well, you should meet Ethan Morgan, our marketing genius. He's right over there." Jason gestured toward the group I'd already identified. "He's a bit intense, but brilliant at what he does." I smiled. "I'd love an introduction." As Jason led me toward Ethan's group, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I'd imagined this moment many times over the years, but now that it was happening, all I felt was readiness. "Ethan," Jason said, interrupting whatever story had the group so captivated. "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Emily Hartwell. Emily, this is Ethan Morgan, our Chief Marketing Officer." Ethan turned, his practiced smile already in place. Then he saw me, and for just a moment, the smile faltered. "Emily," he said, recovering quickly. "Emily Hartwell from Stanford? It's been what, 10 years?" 12, I corrected gently. "It's nice to see you again, Ethan." "You two know each other?" Jason asked, looking between us. "We were in business school together for a year before I transferred to Harvard," Ethan explained, already subtly establishing his credentials. "Emily had some interesting ideas about artisanal businesses. What was it? Candles?" "Luminous. Crafts," I confirmed. "We're still around." "Fascinating," Ethan said, though his tone suggested anything but. "And what brings you to the Emerging Technology Leaders Gala? Branching out from farmers markets?" Before I could answer, Jason interjected. "Emily's here as my guest. We've gotten to know each other through some business connections." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I could see confusion cross Ethan's face as he tried to imagine what business connections could possibly exist between the CEO of a rising tech company and someone he remembered as having small, artisanal business aspirations. "How interesting," he said finally. "Well, you're just in time, Emily. I was telling everyone about Vertex's revolutionary approach to market penetration. We've managed to capture segments that competitors thought were untouchable." "I'd love to hear about it," I said, sipping my champagne. For the next 15 minutes, I listened as Ethan detailed marketing strategies that were, admittedly, innovative, if somewhat aggressive. What he didn't know was that I'd already reviewed all of Vertex's marketing plans as part of our due diligence for the acquisition. I knew exactly where the weak points were: the overallocation of resources to flashy campaigns that delivered short-term gains but little long-term value. "That's the problem with traditional business models," Ethan was saying, now addressing the entire group again. "They're too focused on steady, sustainable growth when they should be disruptive. Go big or go home, right?" Several people nodded appreciatively, while others looked less convinced. I noticed a woman I recognized from the personnel files as Sarah Chen, Vertex's Director of Product Development, giving Ethan a skeptical look. "What about you, Emily?" Ethan asked suddenly, turning his attention back to me. "How's the candle? Business? Still sustainable and artisanal?" His tone made the words sound like quaint anachronisms. "It's doing well," I said simply. "We've expanded our product lines." "Into soap, I imagine? Maybe those little decorative pillows with inspirational sayings." He chuckled, encouraging others to join in. I smiled, refusing to take the bait. Among other things, authenticity never goes out of style. Authenticity doesn't scale, Ethan countered immediately. That's the fundamental flaw in businesses like yours. They're nice little lifestyle companies, but they never become anything significant. I noticed Jason Reynolds shifting uncomfortably. Ethan, I'm sure Emily's business is quite successful in its own way. Of course it is, Ethan agreed magnanimously. But we're talking about different leagues here. Emily's playing in the community softball game while we're in the World Series. I took another sip of champagne, using the moment to maintain my composure. Different approaches work for different goals, I suppose. Exactly, Ethan said, as if I'd just proven his point. Some of us aim to transform industries, and others are content with craft fairs and Etsy shops. I noticed Sarah Chen rolling her eyes slightly behind Ethan's back. Actually, Jason interjected, you might be surprised to learn that small businesses contribute significantly to economic stability and community resilience. I finished quickly, giving Jason a subtle look. It was too soon to reveal my connection to tomorrow's acquisition. But I'd love to hear more about Vertex's latest projects, Jason. You mentioned some exciting developments on the horizon. Jason caught on immediately, launching into a carefully edited version of Vertex's upcoming initiatives. All information I already knew in much greater detail than he was sharing with the group. As the evening progressed, I circulated through the ballroom, meeting other members of Vertex's team and various industry figures. Occasionally, I would catch Ethan watching me with a puzzled expression, clearly trying to figure out my connection to Jason Reynolds. It was nearly 11 when I found myself alone at the bar, waiting for a glass of water. Ethan appeared beside me, ordering another scotch. So, Emily, he said without preamble, what's your real connection to Jason? You're not his type for a date, and you're definitely not in his usual business circle. I raised an eyebrow at his bluntness. Jason and I have mutual interests. In what? He's building next-generation data infrastructure and you're dipping wicks in wax. I felt a flash of the old hurt, the same dismissiveness that had once made me doubt myself in business school. But now, it was just noise. Tomorrow, everything will change. You know, Ethan, not everything valuable is immediately visible, I said carefully. Sometimes the most powerful forces are the ones working quietly, building something lasting rather than just making noise. He laughed. That sounds like something people say to comfort themselves when they're not making an impact. No offense, but handcrafted and artisanal are just code words for small and inconsequential. The bartender handed me my water, and I took a moment before responding. We'll have to agree to disagree on that. But I am curious, how do you define real success in business? Ethan didn't hesitate. Scale, valuation, market disruption. Changing how entire industries operate. Making the kind of impact that gets recognized. Building something that could eventually go public or be acquired for billions. He took a sip of his scotch. Not to be harsh, but that's a world your business will never see. I nodded thoughtfully. And is Vertex on that trajectory, in your opinion? Absolutely, he said confidently. With my marketing strategy and our current growth rate, we'll be acquisition targets for the major players within 2 years. Jason doesn't see it yet. He's too cautious, too old school in his thinking. We could be moving twice as fast if he'd just take more risks. I knew from the financial records that twice as fast would have bankrupted the company within 18 months, but I kept that knowledge to myself. Well, I wish you luck with that, I said sincerely. Because despite everything, I did want Vertex to succeed. It would soon be part of my company after all. Ethan's phone buzzed, and he glanced down at it. Duty calls. Apparently the VP of Engineering is talking to one of our competitors. Need tea. To run interference. He pocketed his phone and gave me a patronizing smile. It was nice catching up, Emily. Good luck with the candles. As he walked away, I couldn't help but think about how tomorrow would unfold. In less than 12 hours, I would walk into Vertex's headquarters, not as Emily who makes candles, but as Emily Hartwell, CEO of Authentica Brands, the company that had just acquired Vertex Innovations. The anticipation of that moment, of Ethan finally understanding just how wrong he'd been about me all these years, was almost overwhelming. But I reminded myself of what my grandmother used to say. Patience isn't just waiting, it's how you behave while you're waiting. I'd been patient for 12 years. I could manage 12 more hours. The car ride home from the gala was quiet. Seattle's nightscape scrolled past my window, the Space Needle illuminated against the dark sky like an exclamation point, fitting punctuation for what tomorrow would bring. My driver, Marcus, had been with me since the early days of Authentica Brands. He'd watched me build this company from nothing, seeing firsthand the late nights and early mornings that had gone into creating something meaningful. "Everything good, Miss Hartwell?" he asked, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. "Just thinking about tomorrow," I replied, slipping off my heels and massaging my feet. "It's been a long road to get here." "That Vertex building sure is something," Marcus commented. "All glass and steel. Very different from your first office above that coffee shop in Fremont." I smiled at the memory. My first real office after moving Luminous Crafts out of my apartment had been a tiny space above the Daily Grind, a local coffee shop owned by my friend Tara. The rent had been cheap, the space perpetually smelling of espresso and cinnamon, and I'd felt like I'd made it to the big leagues just by having a business address that wasn't my home. "Different isn't always better," I said, watching raindrops race each other down the car window. "But in this case, I think the change will be good for everyone, eventually." When I reached my apartment, I kicked off my heels by the door and padded to the kitchen in my stockinged feet. Fitzgerald meowed a greeting, winding between my ankles as I filled the kettle for one last cup of chamomile tea before bed. While the water heated, I pulled out the acquisition folder one more time. The numbers were substantial. $347 million for a company valued at $285 million just 18 months ago. Jason Reynolds had built something valuable, and I intended to honor that, even if some changes would be necessary to align Vertex with Authentica's sustainable business model. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Just saw Ethan Morgan's latest LinkedIn post. Says Vertex is on the precipice of revolutionary growth. If only he knew what precipice they're actually on." I smiled, setting my phone down without responding. Rebecca had never liked Ethan, not since I'd told her about our history in business school. Her loyalty was one of the reasons I'd hired her as my first executive when Authentica began acquiring companies. The tea steeped as I changed into silk pajamas, hanging the Valentino gown carefully in my closet. Tomorrow called for a different kind of armor, my signature navy blue power suit, the one I'd worn for every major acquisition. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night. I'd expected to toss and turn, replaying conversations with Ethan in my mind, anticipating tomorrow's revelation. Instead, I drifted off almost immediately, waking only when my alarm chimed at 5:30 a.m. My morning ritual never varied, regardless of what the day held. Yoga for 30 minutes, shower, light makeup, hair styled simply but precisely, a breakfast of overnight oats with berries, and 2 cups of strong black coffee. The consistency centered me, especially on days that promised to be anything but ordinary. By 7:15, I was dressed in my navy suit with a cream silk blouse, pearl earrings in place, and a slim leather briefcase containing all the final acquisition documents. In the hallway mirror, I hardly recognized myself as the same woman who had once packed handmade candles into recycled boxes on her living room floor. But underneath the polished exterior, I was still Emily, still guided by the same values, still determined to build something meaningful. "The car is waiting, Ms. Hartwell," my doorman announced through the intercom. "Thank you, Joe. I'll be right down." Marcus was waiting with the car door open. "Big day today," he said with a knowing smile. The biggest, I agreed, settling into the back seat. The drive to Vertex Innovations took us through downtown Seattle, past the farmer's market where I'd started selling Luminous Crafts products all those years ago. It was still early, vendors just starting to set up their stalls for the day, unaware that the woman passing by in a luxury sedan had once been one of them. Need me to wait? Marcus asked as we pulled up to Vertex's gleaming headquarters. No. Thank you. I'll be here most of the day. I'll call when I'm ready to leave. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the 20-story glass tower that housed Vertex Innovations. Soon, it would be just one division of Authentica brands, albeit our largest acquisition to date. The lobby was all polished concrete and minimalist design, with a massive digital display showing Vertex's slogan, "Redefining Possible." The receptionist looked up as I approached. Good morning. I'm Emily Hartwell. I have an 8 a.m. meeting with Jason Reynolds. Of course, Ms. Hartwell. Mr. Reynolds is expecting you. 18th floor. The elevator will need a key card. She handed me a visitor badge that would grant access. Someone will meet you when you arrive. The elevator whisked me upward, smooth and silent. As I watched the floor numbers tick by, I thought about how Ethan would react when he learned the truth. Would he be angry? Embarrassed? Would he try to undermine me? Or would he finally see me as an equal, or more accurately, as his superior in the corporate hierarchy? The elevator doors opened onto a reception area with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of Elliott Bay. Jason Reynolds stood waiting, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, leaning slightly on an elegant walking stick, a recent addition following his diagnosis. Emily, he greeted warmly, extending his hand. Right on time. Are you ready for this? More than ready, I assured him. How are you feeling about it? A wistful smile crossed his face. Vertex has been my life for nearly a decade. Letting go isn't easy, but knowing the company will be in your hands makes it considerably easier. Your vision for ethical business practices aligns with what I've always wanted for Vertex, even if market pressures sometimes pushed us in different directions. Jason had been surprisingly receptive when I'd first approached him about the acquisition. Authentica's reputation for maintaining the integrity of its acquired companies while improving their sustainability practices had appealed to him, especially as his health concerns made succession planning more urgent. The board is assembling in the conference room, Jason continued, gesturing down a hallway. Legal teams are already reviewing the final paperwork. We should join them. And the executive team? I asked, thinking specifically of Ethan. They've been told there's an important announcement at 9:30. They know it's about the company's future, but the details have been kept confidential, as we agreed. The next hour passed in a blur of signatures, handshakes, and legal terminology. By 9:15, it was official. Vertex Innovations was now part of Authentica Brands, with me as the new CEO. Jason would stay on for 6 months as an advisor to ease the transition. It's time, Jason said, checking his watch. The executive team should be assembled by now. We walked together to a large conference room where 8 people sat around a polished table, murmuring quietly among themselves. I recognized them all from their personnel files. Sarah Chen, Director of Product Development, Anthony Wilson, Chief Technology Officer, Rachel Patel, Chief Financial Officer, Ethan Morgan, Chief Marketing Officer, and 4 senior vice presidents from various departments. Ethan was the first to notice us enter. His eyes passed over me briefly, then snapped back, confusion evident on his face. I could almost see the thoughts racing through his mind. What was the woman who made candles doing in this high-level corporate meeting? Good morning, everyone, Jason began, taking his place at the head of the table. Thank you for joining us. Today marks a significant transition for Vertex Innovations. The room grew completely silent. I remained standing just inside the doorway, observing the reactions of each executive. As some of you know, my health has made it necessary for me to step back from day-to-day operations, Jason continued. What you don't know is that for the past 3 months, we've been in acquisition talks with Authentica Brands. Several executives exchanged glances. Anthony Wilson leaned forward, brow furrowed. Authentica? The sustainable products conglomerate? Exactly, Jason confirmed. As of 15 minutes ago, the acquisition is complete. Vertex Innovations is now part of the Authentica family of companies. Rachel Patel, the CFO, was quickly calculating implications. What does this mean for our growth strategy, our market positioning, our IPO plans? All excellent questions, Jason acknowledged. And the person best equipped to answer them is standing right here. He gestured toward me. I'd like to introduce Emily Hartwell, founder and CEO of Authentica Brands, and now the new chief executive of Vertex Innovations. I stepped forward as every head turned in my direction. The expressions ranged from surprise to confusion to outright disbelief. Ethan's face had gone completely blank, a sure sign he was struggling to process this information. "Thank you, Jason," I said, my voice calm and measured. "I know this comes as a surprise to most of you. Let me first assure everyone that Authentica doesn't acquire companies to dismantle them. We believe in preserving what makes each business special while helping it align more closely with sustainable practices and ethical business models." Sarah Chen was the first to recover. "Ms. Hartwell, I've followed Authentica's work integrating renewable materials into consumer products. Your approach to supply chain transformation is revolutionary." I smiled. "Thank you, Sarah. And please, call me Emily. I'm looking forward to seeing how we can apply some of those same principles to Vertex's operations." Ethan finally found his voice. "Emily," he said, my name sounding strange in his mouth. "I don't understand. Last night at the gala, you said you were running a candle business." "Luminous Crafts was my first company," I confirmed. "It's now one of 18 businesses under the Authentica umbrella. We've grown considerably since our farmers market days." The look on Ethan's face was worth every moment of the past 12 years. Every dismissive comment, every condescending remark, every time he'd used my business as an example of thinking too small. Anthony Wilson cleared his throat. "What's the timeline for integration? Will there be structural changes to the organization?" "Great question," I replied, grateful for the shift to practical matters. "Over the next 6 months, we'll be conducting a thorough assessment of all operations. Jason has generously agreed to stay on as an advisor during this transition period." I outlined the immediate next steps, answered questions about Authentic A's business model, and addressed concerns about potential layoffs. There would be none, though some priorities would shift. Throughout the discussion, I was acutely aware of Ethan's gaze, watching me with an unsettling intensity. When the meeting concluded, the executives filed out, many stopping to introduce themselves more formally or express cautious optimism about the acquisition. Ethan lingered, clearly waiting for the opportunity to speak with me privately. "Emily," he said when we were finally alone, "I think we need to talk." "Of course," I agreed. "But first, I have several calls scheduled with key clients to inform them of the transition. Perhaps we could meet in my office." I paused deliberately. "I mean, in the CEO's office at 2 p.m.? A muscle twitches in his jaw. "Fine, 2 p.m. As he turned to leave, I called after him. "Oh, and Ethan? Could you bring the marketing plans for next quarter? I'd like to review them." He stiffened but nodded curtly before exiting. Jason, who had observed this exchange, chuckled softly. "I take it you two have some history beyond what you mentioned." "You could say that," I admitted. "Ethan has always been very clear about what he thinks of small, artisanal businesses like the one where I started." "And now you own the company where he works," Jason mused. "Life has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it?" "It certainly does," I agreed. The CEO's office, my office now, was a corner suite with stunning views of both the Seattle skyline and the distant Olympic Mountains. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides created a sense of floating above the city. A sleek desk dominated one end of the room, with a comfortable seating area arranged at the other. I took a moment to absorb it all, remembering how far I'd come from that tiny space above the daily grind. This office was approximately 10 times the size of my first workspace, with furnishings that probably cost more than my entire first year's revenue from Luminous Crafts. Rebecca arrived shortly before noon, bringing lunch and a stack of Authentica folders. "So?" she asked, setting everything on the conference table. "How did Morgan take the news?" "About as well as you'd expect," I replied, opening the container of salad she'd brought. "He's coming to meet with me at 2 p.m. Want me to sit in?" I could take notes or just glare at him intimidatingly. I laughed. Tempting, but no. This is a conversation Ethan and I need to have alone. "Fair enough, but I want a full report afterward." Rebecca opened her laptop. "Now I've compiled the initial integration documents. The team is ready to begin assessment next week." We spent the next hour reviewing plans and priorities for Vertex's integration into Authentica. Under normal circumstances, I would have been fully engaged in this process, but today my thoughts kept drifting to my upcoming meeting with Ethan. At precisely 2 p.m., my assistant, Jason's former assistant, now mine, announced Ethan's arrival. He entered carrying a sleek presentation folder, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for bringing the marketing materials," I said, gesturing to the seating area. "Please, have a seat." Ethan sat stiffly on the edge of a chair, placing the folder on the coffee table between us. "Before we discuss marketing plans, I think we should address the elephant in the room." "And what elephant would that be?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "You deliberately misled me at the gala last night," he said, his tone accusatory. "You let me believe you were still running a small candle business when you were actually in the process of acquiring my company." "I don't recall misleading you," I replied calmly. "You assumed Luminous Crafts was still my only business. I simply didn't correct that assumption. You said you'd expanded your product lines, and that's entirely accurate. Authentica has expanded into 18 different product categories, from home goods to sustainable textiles to technology components." His jaw tightened. "You knew I was making incorrect assumptions." "Yes," I acknowledged. "Just as you've made incorrect assumptions about me and my business acumen for the past 12 years. That struck home. Ethan leaned back, studying me as if seeing me for the first time. "So this is what? Revenge for some perceived slight during business school?" "This is business, Ethan. Nothing more, nothing less. Vertex is a valuable company with significant potential, especially if certain adjustments are made to its operational model." "Adjustments," he repeated flatly. "Like what?" "Like a more sustainable approach to growth, like ethical sourcing requirements for all components, like employee wellness programs that actually support work-life balance instead of just paying lip service to it." His eyes narrowed. "Those sound like expensive distractions from our core business objectives." "That attitude is precisely why adjustments are necessary," I said. "Authentica has demonstrated repeatedly that ethical business practices and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, our portfolio companies average 23% higher retention rates and 18% greater productivity than industry standards. And I suppose you have data to back that up?" "Of course," I replied, sliding a report across the table to him. "I've always believed in making decisions based on evidence rather than ego. That's one difference between us that hasn't changed since Stanford." Ethan flipped through the report, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to reluctant interest. Finally, he closed it and looked up at me. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "Not just recently, but consistently, for years." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Ethan Morgan, it was practically a full surrender. "Yes," I agreed simply. "You did." "So what happens now?" he asked. "Are you firing me? Is this the part where you get your revenge by showing me the door?" I studied him for a moment before answering. Despite his arrogance, Ethan was undeniably talented. His marketing strategies, while sometimes too aggressive for my taste, had helped position Vertex as an industry leader. That depends, I said. Finally. Can you adapt to Authentica's business philosophy? Can you apply your considerable marketing talents to promoting sustainable technologies instead of just chasing market share at any cost? Ethan's brow furrowed. You'd keep me on? Even after everything? Like I said, this is business, not personal. If you can add value to Vertex under its new direction, there's no reason we can't work together. He sat back, clearly processing this unexpected turn of events. For years, he'd dismissed my business approach as naive and small thinking. Now he was being asked to adopt that very approach by his new boss. I'd need to understand more about this new direction, he said finally. Of course, I agreed. That's a reasonable request. I gestured to the folder he'd brought. But first, let's review those marketing plans. I'm particularly interested in the allocation of resources between digital campaigns and relationship-building initiatives. As Ethan opened the folder and began walking me through his strategies, I could see the wheels turning in his mind, recalibrating his understanding of me, of Authentica, and of his own place in this new reality. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The woman he'd once dismissed as playing at business was now controlling the fate of his career. It wasn't about revenge. I'd meant that sincerely. But there was undeniable satisfaction in finally being seen. These projections, I said, pointing to a chart in his presentation, they seem overly optimistic given the market conditions we're seeing. They're aggressive but achievable, Ethan insisted. We've consistently exceeded expectations in previous quarters. At what cost? I asked. According to the financial reports, your department has gone over budget by 15% for 3 consecutive quarters. He blinked, surprised that I had this information at my fingertips. The ROI justifies the additional expenditure. In the short term, perhaps. But sustainable business isn't about quick wins, Ethan. It's about building something that lasts, something I think you're beginning to understand. Outside the windows of what was now my office, Seattle continued its busy afternoon rhythm, unaware of the small drama playing out 18 stories above the street. The Space Needle stood in the distance, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements start with a radical vision that others might dismiss as impractical or too ambitious, much like a small candle business that grew into something powerful enough to acquire a tech company and surprise the man who never believed it possible. By the time my meeting with Ethan concluded, the news of Authentica's acquisition of Vertex had spread throughout the company. The hallways buzzed with speculation and uncertainty as employees tried to understand what this meant for their future. I'd anticipated this reaction. Change always breeds anxiety, especially when it comes unexpectedly. We should address the staff directly, I told Rebecca as we walked through the executive floor. People need to hear from me, not just through rumors or internal memos. I've already set it up, Rebecca replied. All hands meeting in the central atrium at 4:30. We'll live stream it to the remote employees too. One of the things I valued most about Rebecca was her ability to anticipate needs before I voiced them. We'd developed an almost telepathic working relationship over the years, starting from when she was the only other employee at Authentica besides me. How did it go with Morgan? She asked, unable to hide her curiosity any longer. Better than expected, actually. He's processing. Rebecca arched an eyebrow. Processing as in plotting revenge, or processing as in reconsidering his entire worldview? A bit of both, I think. He's too smart not to see the opportunity this presents for his career, but his ego is definitely bruised. Good, Rebecca said firmly. After the way he's treated you over the years, his ego could use more than bruising. I smiled at her loyalty but shook my head. This isn't about settling scores, Becca. We need the strongest possible team to make this integration work. If Ethan can adapt to our way of doing business, his marketing expertise would be valuable. And if he can't adapt, then he'll find himself increasingly marginalized until he either changes or leaves. But I'd rather give him the chance to grow than force him out. As we rounded the corner, we nearly collided with Sarah Chen, Vertex's director of product development. She was carrying a stack of folders and a tablet, looking harried but determined. "Ms. Hartwell, Emily," she corrected herself. "I'm glad I ran into you. I've been reviewing some of Authentica's sustainability guidelines, and I have several ideas for how we can adapt our current product development pipeline to align with them." I was impressed by her initiative. "That's excellent, Sarah. I'd love to hear your thoughts." "I've prepared some preliminary notes," she said, shifting the folders in her arms. "Our latest project, the V7 sensor array, could be redesigned using biodegradable components for 60% of the chassis without compromising functionality. Send everything to my office," I told her, "and let's schedule a proper meeting for tomorrow to discuss it in detail." Sarah nodded eagerly before continuing on her way. As we watched her go, Rebecca murmured, "Now there's someone who adapts quickly to change." "Some people see change as an opportunity rather than a threat," I agreed. "Those are the people who will thrive at the new Vertex." The central atrium of Vertex's headquarters was an architectural showpiece, a soaring open space stretching up, through 4 floors, with a glass ceiling that allowed natural light to flood down onto the living wall of tropical plants that covered one side. It had been designed as a collaborative space, with various seating arrangements scattered throughout and a small cafe at one end. By 4:25, the atrium was packed with Vertex employees. Some sat in the designated seating areas, others stood in clusters, while still more leaned over the railings of the upper floors, all waiting to hear from their new CEO. I took a deep breath as I surveyed the crowd from a small alcove near the temporary stage that had been set up. These were now my employees, hundreds of talented individuals whose professional lives would be affected by my decisions. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to shape this company into something even better than it already was. "Ready?" Rebecca asked, appearing at my side. I nodded, smoothing my blazer one last time before stepping onto the stage. A hush fell over the atrium as I approached the microphone. From my position, I could see Ethan standing near the back, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. Jason Reynolds sat in the front row, offering me an encouraging smile. "Good afternoon, everyone," I began. "For those who haven't heard yet, my name is Emily Hartwell. As of this morning, I am the CEO of Vertex Innovations, which is now part of the Authentica Brands family of companies." I paused, letting the murmurs ripple through the crowd before continuing. "I know this comes as a surprise to most of you. Change, especially unexpected change, can be unsettling. So I want to take this opportunity to tell you about Authentica, about myself, and most importantly, about what this means for Vertex going forward." Over the next 20 minutes, I outlined Authentica's history, our approach to business, and our vision for Vertex's future. I emphasized our commitment to sustainability without sacrificing innovation, our belief in ethical business practices, and our track record of growing acquired companies rather than dismantling them. "Some of you may be wondering about job security," I said, addressing the concern that was undoubtedly on many minds. "Let me be clear. This acquisition is not about cost-cutting or downsizing. It's about growth, responsible, sustainable growth. We didn't acquire Vertex to reduce it. We acquired it because we believe in its potential." Relief visibly washed over many faces in the audience. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Ethan's posture relaxing slightly. "That said," I continued, "there will be changes. Our priorities may shift, our methods may evolve, but these changes will be implemented thoughtfully, with input from the talented team already in place here at Vertex." I went on to explain the integration timeline, introduced Rebecca and other key members of the Authentica team who would be working closely with Vertex during the transition, and outlined the immediate next steps. When I finished my prepared remarks, I opened the floor for questions. They came rapidly. Questions about benefits, about reporting structures, about ongoing projects, about Authentica's other companies. I answered each one candidly, admitting when I didn't yet have all the answers but promising transparency throughout. The process. A young engineer in a Vertex logo t-shirt raised his hand. What made you want to acquire Vertex specifically? Out of all the tech companies out there, why us? It was a good question, one that got to the heart of my vision for both companies. Vertex has developed some of the most innovative sensor technology in the industry, I replied, but what truly sets it apart is the potential applications of that technology for environmental monitoring, sustainable agriculture, and energy efficiency. While the current marketing focus has been primarily on industrial and commercial applications, we see tremendous opportunity in the sustainability sector. As I elaborated on this vision, I noticed several employees nodding thoughtfully, including Sarah Chen, who was scribbling notes furiously. Another hand went up, this time from a woman in marketing whom I recognized from the organization chart as one of Ethan's direct reports. Will our marketing strategy change? We've been very focused on aggressive growth and market disruption. I could feel Ethan watching me intently, waiting for my answer. Marketing will certainly evolve, I acknowledged. Authentica believes in authentic relationship building rather than disruption for its own sake. We focus on communicating genuine value rather than creating artificial scarcity or FOMO. That said, we still value creativity and innovation in our approach. We just direct it toward different goals. I could practically see the wheels turning in Ethan's mind as he processed this. As the Q&A concluded, I made one final statement. My door is open. Not just today or this week, but always. Authentica believes in collaborative leadership, not top-down directives. I don't have all the answers, and I don't pretend to. What I do have is a vision for what we can build together and a commitment to doing it the right way. The response was cautiously positive, exactly what I'd expected. Trust would need to be earned over time, not won in a single speech. As the crowd dispersed, various employees approached me with individual questions or simply to introduce themselves. I made a point of engaging with each one, demonstrating through actions rather than just words that I valued their input. Eventually, the atrium cleared except for a few small groups still engaged in animated discussion. Jason approached, leaning on his walking stick. "Well done," he said with genuine approval. "You struck exactly the right note, not too revolutionary, not too conservative." "Thanks, Jason. I just hope they give it a chance to work before judging." "Most will," he assured me, "the ones worth keeping anyway." I glanced toward the back of the atrium where Ethan stood in conversation with Anthony Wilson, the CTO. They appeared to be having an intense discussion, with Ethan gesturing emphatically. "Looks like not everyone is convinced yet," I observed. Jason followed my gaze. "Ah, Ethan. He's brilliant, but change has never been his forte. Unless it's change he's initiating. Give him time. He's adaptable when it serves his interests." "And Anthony?" "Tony's a pragmatist. He goes where the innovation is. If you can convince him that Authentica's approach won't stifle technological development, he'll be on board." I made a mental note to schedule a one-on-one with Anthony as soon as possible. As CTO, his support would be crucial for a successful integration. By 6:30 that evening, most employees had gone home, though lights still burned in various offices throughout the building. I was reviewing documents in my new office when Rebecca appeared in the doorway. "The executive team is requesting a dinner meeting," she announced. "Apparently it's a tradition after major company announcements. They go to Sullivan's Steakhouse and discuss implications privately." I raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" "Ethan, Anthony, Rachel, and Sarah. The core leadership team." "Did they actually invite me, or are you just finding out about this tradition? Rebecca smiled wryly. Ethan mentioned it to your assistant who told me. I think it's their way of extending an olive branch while also getting you on their turf. I considered this for a moment. Declining would send the wrong message, but I also recognized the strategic element at play. The executive team wanted to size me up outside the office environment, perhaps hoping I'd reveal more of my plans in a social setting. Tell them I'd be delighted to join, I decided. But suggest Altura instead of Sullivan's. Rebecca's smile widened. Changing the venue. Nice power move. It's not about power, I corrected her. Sullivan's is known for its heavy meat focus. Altura has excellent sustainable seafood options and farm-to-table vegetable dishes. It aligns better with Authentica's values. Sure, Rebecca said, clearly unconvinced. Nothing to do with establishing who's really in charge of this dinner. I shook my head, but couldn't help smiling. Just make the arrangements, please, and then go home. It's been a long day. What about you? Do you want me to sit in on this dinner? I could claim a pressing need to discuss integration details. I appreciate the offer, but no. I need to build relationships with this team, and that starts with meeting them on their terms, even if I did change the restaurant. After Rebecca left, I spent a few minutes researching each executive's background beyond what I already knew from their personnel files. It was important to understand their motivations, their career trajectories, and what they might value most in this transition. Rachel Patel, the CFO, had come to Vertex from a larger corporation where she'd been part of an aggressive cost-cutting initiative. Her challenge would be adapting to Authentica's philosophy that sometimes spending more upfront on sustainable practices led to greater long-term profitability. Anthony Wilson had built his career on technological innovation, with several patents to his name. He would need reassurance that Authentica's sustainability focus wouldn't limit his team's creative freedom. Sarah Chen was already showing enthusiasm for the acquisition, but she was relatively new to the executive team and might face resistance from longer-tenured colleagues if she allied herself too quickly with the new leadership. And then there was Ethan. Brilliant but arrogant, adaptable but resistant to change he didn't initiate. Our history complicated things, but it also gave me insight into his thinking that I lacked with the others. At 7:45, I left for Altura, having changed from my navy suit into a more dinner-appropriate outfit, a tailored charcoal gray dress that was professional but not overly formal. As Marcus drove me through the evening traffic, I reflected on how differently this day had unfolded compared to my expectations. I'd anticipated more resistance from Ethan, more anxiety from the staff, more challenges to my authority. Instead, the transition had been surprisingly smooth so far, cautious optimism rather than outright opposition. Of course, this was just the first day. The real test would come in the weeks ahead as we began implementing changes and Authentica's philosophy began influencing Vertex's operations. When I arrived at Altura, the maitre d' informed me that the rest of my party had already been seated. He led me to a private dining room at the back of the restaurant, where the 4 Vertex executives were engaged in hushed conversation that abruptly ceased when I entered. "Good evening," I greeted them, taking the empty chair at the head of the table. "Thank you for including me in this tradition." "Thank you for suggesting Altura," Sarah replied warmly. "I've been wanting to try it for ages. The wine list is exceptional," I noted, accepting a menu from the server. "I particularly recommend their Washington State Pinot Noirs. I'm more of a bourbon man myself," Anthony remarked, raising a tumbler that already appeared half empty. Rachel Patel studied me with calculating eyes. "Interesting choice of venue. Sullivan's has been our go-to for executive dinners since Vertex's founding. Sometimes new traditions can be even better than established ones," I replied smoothly. "I hope you'll find that to be true of many of the changes ahead." Ethan, who had remained conspicuously silent until now, finally spoke. "Are we here for dinner or for more company announcements?" Can't it be both? I asked lightly. Breaking. Bred together is one of the oldest forms of building trust, and trust is exactly what we need to establish between us if this transition is going to succeed. The tension at the table was palpable, but not entirely hostile. These were smart, ambitious professionals trying to gauge how this sudden change in leadership would affect their careers, their projects, and their daily work lives. As the server came to take our drink orders, I decided on a straightforward approach. I imagine you all have questions that you didn't want to ask in front of the entire company this afternoon. Consider this a safe space to voice those concerns. No judgment, no repercussions, just honest conversation about where we go from here. Sarah was the first to take the opening. Will our current projects continue, or should we expect a complete overhaul of the development pipeline? Current projects will be evaluated individually, I explained. Those that align with Authentica's values and direction will continue, possibly with some adjustments. Others may be phased out or redirected, but this won't happen overnight, and it won't happen without input from the teams involved. Anthony leaned forward. Vertex has built its reputation on cutting-edge innovation. Some of our best work comes from rapid development cycles that don't always leave time for the kind of sustainability assessments Authentica seems to prioritize. Innovation and sustainability aren't mutually exclusive, I countered. In fact, some of the most innovative work happening today is precisely in finding sustainable alternatives to traditional materials and methods. I'm not suggesting we slow down, I'm suggesting we direct that innovative energy toward solving different problems. Rachel, ever the numbers person, cut to the chase. Bottom line, what happens to our profitability targets? Sustainable materials generally cost more upfront. Are shareholders prepared for potentially lower margins in the short term? I appreciated her directness. Authentica is privately held, which gives us more flexibility than public companies when it comes to short-term versus long-term thinking. Yes, some sustainable materials cost more initially, but our experience across multiple industries has shown that the total cost of ownership is often lower when you factor in longevity, reduced waste, and consumer loyalty to sustainable brands. Throughout this exchange, Ethan remained unusually quiet, observing the dynamic with sharp eyes. When he finally spoke again, his question caught me off guard. Why Vertex? With Authentica's resources, you could have acquired any number of tech companies. Why this one? It was the same question the young engineer had asked earlier, but coming from Ethan, it carried a different weight. He wasn't just asking about Vertex. He was asking about himself, about whether my history with him had influenced the decision. I met his gaze directly. Because Vertex has developed technology that could have profound positive impacts on environmental monitoring, renewable energy efficiency, and sustainable agriculture, if it were properly directed toward those applications. The potential alignment with Authentica's mission is remarkable, even if that potential hasn't been fully realized yet. I picked up my wine glass, taking a small sip before continuing. But I suspect that's not what you're really asking, Ethan. So let me be clear. This acquisition was a business decision, not a personal one. The fact that you work here was a complication, not a motivation. A flash of something, relief, disappointment, crossed his face before his professional mask returned. Fair enough. As the dinner progressed, the conversation gradually shifted from business to more neutral topics. Sarah and Anthony got into an animated discussion about a local hiking trail they'd both recently discovered. Rachel mentioned a concert series she'd been attending at Benaroya Hall. Even Ethan eventually relaxed enough to share an amusing story about a misunderstanding with a client in Tokyo. By the time dessert arrived, the atmosphere had transformed from tense calculation to something approaching collegial. These were still relationships in their earliest stages, fragile and uncertain, but the foundation was being laid for what could eventually become a cohesive leadership team. As we prepared to leave, I made one final observation. Change is rarely comfortable, but it's often necessary for growth. Vertex was already a good company. Together, we can make it an extraordinary one. Outside the restaurant, as we waited for our respective cars, Ethan hung back until the others had departed. "So," he said, hands in his pockets, "Authentica brands. Quite a leap from handmade candles." "Less of a leap than you might think," I replied. "The same principles apply, just at a different scale." He was quiet for a moment, seemingly lost in thought. Then, with uncharacteristic candor, he asked, "Do I actually have a place in this new version of Vertex, Emily? Or are you just waiting for the right moment to show me the door?" The vulnerability in the question surprised me. For all his bravado, Ethan was genuinely uncertain about his future, perhaps for the first time in his career. "That depends entirely on you," I told him honestly. "Your marketing brilliance isn't in question, but Authentica's approach requires putting purpose before profit, sustainability before short-term gains. If you can embrace that shift, there's absolutely a place for you, a significant one. And if I can't, then you'll be increasingly frustrated, and eventually, you'll leave on your own. But I'm not planning to fire you, Ethan. I'm hoping to convince you." His car arrived first, a sleek black Tesla that purred to the curb. As he opened the door, he paused, looking back at me with an unreadable expression. "You know," he said finally, 12 years ago, I was absolutely certain I knew more about business than you ever would. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life." With that surprisingly humble admission, he slid into his car and drove away, leaving me standing there in the gentle Seattle rain, wondering if perhaps there was hope for Ethan Morgan after all. The first week of Vertex's integration into Authentica passed in a whirlwind of meetings, assessments, and strategic planning sessions. Each day brought new challenges, from reconciling different corporate cultures to addressing the concerns of key clients who were uncertain about the acquisition. Through it all, I maintained the calm, measured approach that had defined my leadership style at Authentica. By Friday afternoon, I was reviewing preliminary reports from our integration team when my assistant announced that Sarah Chen was requesting a few minutes of my time. "Send her in," I said, setting aside the reports. In just 5 days, Sarah had emerged as one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the acquisition, approaching the changes with creativity and optimism rather than resistance. Sarah entered carrying her ever-present tablet and a rolled-up set of blueprints. "Sorry to interrupt, Emily, but I wanted to catch you before the weekend. I've been working on something I think you'll find interesting." She unrolled the blueprints. On my desk, weighing down the corners with various objects from my desk. "This is a redesign of our V7 sensor array, incorporating biodegradable materials and a modular construction that makes components easily replaceable rather than forcing customers to replace the entire unit when something fails." I leaned forward, examining the detailed designs. "This is impressive work, Sarah. How long have you been developing this?" "The redesign? Just since Monday." She smiled at my surprised expression. "I'd been thinking about this approach for months, but Anthony and Ethan kept pushing for faster production and lower unit costs, which meant sticking with traditional materials and sealed construction. And now? Now I have a CEO who understands that sustainability can be a competitive advantage, not just a buzzword." Her enthusiasm was palpable. "This design actually reduces manufacturing costs by 4% while extending the product lifespan by an estimated 62%. The materials are more expensive, but the simplified assembly process offsets that completely." I studied the blueprints more carefully. "Have you shown this to Anthony yet?" "Not yet. I wanted your green light first, especially since it would mean pivoting from our current production schedule. Let's bring him in on this right away," I decided. "If you can get his technical support, we could make this the first tangible example of Authentica's influence on Vertex products." Sarah's face lit up. "That would be amazing. I'll set up a meeting for Monday morning." After she left, I sat back in my chair, thinking about the changes already taking place at Vertex. Sarah wasn't alone in her response to the acquisition. Throughout the company, I'd noticed employees falling into three categories: the enthusiasts, like Sarah, who embraced the new direction; the wait-and-see group, who were cautiously observing before committing; and the resistors, who viewed any change as a threat to how things have always been done. Interestingly, Ethan hadn't fallen neatly into any of these categories. Since our dinner meeting, he'd been professional, engaged, and surprisingly open to discussion, but also reserved, as if still processing the dramatic shift in our dynamic. In executive meetings, he offered insights when asked, but rarely volunteered them, a noticeable change from the dominating presence Jason had described him as being. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Quarterly reports ready for review. Also, a press release about the acquisition getting major traction. Sustainable Business Journal requesting an interview with you next week. I texted back, schedule the interview. Important to get our narrative out there before speculation takes over. The acquisition had remained relatively low profile in the general press, but within industry circles, it was significant news. A sustainable products conglomerate acquiring a cutting-edge tech firm represented an unusual cross-industry move, sparking debate about whether this signaled a new trend in corporate consolidation. Just as I was preparing to leave for the day, my assistant announced one more visitor, Rachel Patel, Vertex's CFO. Rachel entered with her characteristic directness, getting straight to the point as she sat down. I've been analyzing our financial integration with Authentica, and I have some concerns about the timeline for implementing sustainability initiatives. The capital expenditures in Q3 could create significant cash flow challenges. I've reviewed the projections, I replied. The immediate investments are substantial, but the ROI timeline is actually faster than most of our previous integrations. Rachel tapped her fingers on the arm of her chair, a habit I'd noticed when she was processing information that contradicted her expectations. Authentica's other acquisitions were primarily in consumer goods. Technology hardware operates on different margins and timelines. True, but the principles remain the same. I pulled up a financial model on my computer, turning the screen so she could see it. This is from our acquisition of SolarTex 3 years ago, a completely different industry from our origins, but we still achieved profitability ahead of schedule using the same approach we're proposing here. She leaned forward, studying the numbers with the intense focus of someone who speaks the language of finance fluently. After several minutes, she looked up. Your depreciation schedules are unusually conservative. We've found that sustainability investments tend to hold their value longer than traditional assets. Less obsolescence, more adaptability. Rachel continued examining the model, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed both her skepticism and her analytical rigor. I appreciated her thoroughness. A good CFO should challenge assumptions rather than simply accepting them. Finally, she sat back. I'd like to revisit the phasing of these investments, not to delay them, but to optimize the timing relative to our cash positions. Of course, I agreed. Work with Rebecca on revising the timeline. What isn't negotiable, but when is flexible within reason? She nodded, gathering her materials. One more thing. Ethan has been pushing for an increased Q4 marketing budget to reposition the brand post-acquisition. I've been holding him off until I spoke with you. What's your assessment? Financially, we could support it. Strategically, I'm not convinced. His approach aligns with what you've outlined as Authentica's philosophy. Send me his proposal, I told her. I'll review it over the weekend. After Rachel left, I sat alone in the growing twilight of my office, watching as the lights of Seattle began to illuminate the darkening sky. The Space Needle was lit up in green and blue, a coincidental echo of Authentica's brand colors. My phone rang. Grace Thompson, my childhood friend and personal attorney. Just checking in on how the first week went, she said when I answered. Conquering the corporate world as expected? I laughed. Hardly conquering. More like carefully renovating. One relationship at a time. And how's our friend Ethan adjusting to his new reality? Surprisingly well, actually. Almost suspiciously well. You think he's plotting something? I considered this. Not plotting, exactly. More like recalibrating. He's too smart not to see that fighting this change would be career suicide. But he's also too proud to simply fall in line without having some influence on the direction. Speaking of influence, Grace said, her tone shifting to something more serious. Are we still on for the Green Innovation Summit next month? The organizers want to confirm you'll be delivering the keynote. The Green Innovation Summit was an annual conference that had grown from a small gathering of sustainability-focused entrepreneurs to one of the most influential events in the industry. I'd attended for years as Luminous Crafts had grown into Authentica, first as a participant, then as a panelist, and now as the invited keynote speaker. Absolutely, I confirmed. The topic is even more relevant now with Vertex in our portfolio. Great. One more thing. They mentioned that Vertex had already confirmed a sponsorship before the acquisition. Apparently, Ethan Morgan is scheduled to lead a breakout session on marketing disruption in the tech sector. This was news to me. Interesting. That creates a rather awkward dynamic, doesn't it? Only if you let it, Grace replied. It could actually be the perfect opportunity to publicly demonstrate how Authentica and Vertex are aligning their visions. After we hung up, I made a note to discuss the summit with Ethan on Monday. If he was truly committed to adapting to Authentica's philosophy, this would be an ideal opportunity to demonstrate that commitment. The weekend passed quickly. I spent Saturday morning at Pike Place Market, a ritual I'd maintained since my early days selling Luminous Crafts products there. Now, instead of manning a booth, I wandered through the market as a customer, stopping to chat with vendors I'd known for years, many of whom had no idea that the woman buying honey and handmade soap was now the CEO of a company that had just acquired Vertex Innovations. That afternoon, I reviewed Ethan's marketing proposal as promised. The document was impressively thorough, outlining a comprehensive strategy for repositioning Vertex in the marketplace post-acquisition. What struck me most, however, was how much of Authentica's language and values he'd already incorporated. Phrases like sustainable innovation and ethical technology appeared throughout, suggesting either a remarkable conversion or a strategic adaptation. Knowing Ethan, I suspected the latter. He was nothing if not adaptable when his career demanded it. The real question was whether this adaptation was merely superficial or the beginning of a genuine shift in his thinking. Monday morning brought a fresh wave of meetings and decisions. The first item on my agenda was one-on-one with Ethan to discuss both his marketing proposal and the upcoming Green Innovation Summit. He arrived precisely on time, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that managed to look both conservative and cutting-edge. Much like the marketing strategy he'd proposed. I read your proposal over the weekend, I began after we'd seated ourselves in the comfortable chairs near the window rather than across the desk from each other. It's quite a pivot from your previous approach. The acquisition necessitates a repositioning, he replied smoothly. Vertex's brand needs to evolve to reflect its new parent company's values while maintaining its own identity. And you're comfortable with that evolution? It's quite a departure from the movie fast and break things philosophy you've championed in the past. Ethan met my gaze directly. I'm pragmatic, Emily. When the landscape changes, successful marketers adapt. Besides, he added with the ghost of his old confident smile, sustainable innovation offers its own kind of disruption, just with a longer time horizon than Silicon Valley typically considers. I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. The budget Rachel mentioned seems excessive for what you're proposing. The initial investment needs to be substantial to cut through the noise. We're essentially launching a new brand identity, while reassuring existing clients that we're still the same innovative company they've trusted. And the experiential marketing event in Aspen? How does that align with our sustainable values? Ethan shifted slightly. The first crack in his composed facade? That's negotiable. I included it because it's been highly effective for reaching certain high-value clients in the past. I'm sure it has, I acknowledged, but it's inconsistent with how Authentica builds relationships. We prefer substance over spectacle, he nodded, making a note on his tablet. I can rework that section. The ski resort setting could be replaced with something more aligned with environmental values. Perhaps a series of regional innovation workshops focused on sustainable technology. Applications? That's more like it, I agreed. Work up a revised proposal with that approach, and we can discuss the budget again. Ethan made another note, then looked up expectantly. Was there something else you wanted to discuss? The Green Innovation Summit next month. I understand you're scheduled to lead a breakout session. That's right. Marketing disruption in the tech sector. It was arranged before the acquisition, of course. Of course, I echoed. The organizers have asked me to deliver the keynote address. Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. Congratulations, that's a significant platform. It is. And it presents an interesting opportunity for us to demonstrate the alignment between Vertex and Authentica. I'd like your breakout session to reflect the new direction we're heading. You want me to change my presentation? His tone remained neutral, but I could sense the resistance beneath it. I want us to be consistent in how we represent the company, I clarified. Marketing disruption doesn't align with Authentica's approach, nor with the future of Vertex under our ownership. Ethan was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he asked, "What would you suggest as an alternative topic?" Authentic marketing in the tech sector. Building relationships through transparency and sustainability, I proposed. It maintains your expertise domain while shifting the focus to align with our values. I could almost see him calculating the professional politics of the situation, the visibility of the summit, the career implications of publicly embracing Authentica's philosophy, the watching eyes of both his industry peers and his new boss. I'll need to completely rewrite my presentation, he said finally. Yes, you will, I agreed. But I think you'll find it's an investment worth making, both for Vertex and for your own professional development. He nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than resentful. I appreciate the clarity and the opportunity to represent the company in this new context. As Ethan left my office, I couldn't help but wonder what was really going on behind his carefully composed exterior. The ease with which he was adapting to Authentica's approach seemed almost too convenient, too calculated. Yet I couldn't deny that the work he was producing showed real understanding of what we were trying to achieve. Was it possible that beneath his arrogance and dismissiveness, Ethan had always understood the value of sustainable business practices, but simply chosen a different path? Or was this merely an impressive display of professional flexibility, a chameleon changing colors to match his new environment? Later that morning, I joined Sarah Chen's meeting with Anthony Wilson to discuss her redesigned sensor array. The presentation was taking place in one of Vertex's innovation labs, a large open space filled with prototypes, testing equipment, and digital displays. When I arrived, Sarah was already walking Anthony through the technical specifications, pointing out key features on both physical models and detailed digital renderings. The modular design not only improves repairability, but actually enhances performance, she was explaining. By optimizing each component individually, we achieve better results than with the integrated approach. Anthony circled the physical prototype, examining it from different angles with the critical eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating new technologies. The heat dispersion pattern is different. Yes, Sarah confirmed eagerly. The bio-based polymer conducts heat more efficiently than the petroleum-based plastic we've been using. That means less energy wasted as heat, which extends battery life by approximately 14%. I watched their interaction with interest, noting how Anthony's initial skepticism was gradually giving way to professional curiosity. He asked penetrating questions about durability, weather resistance, and manufacturing complexity, all of which Sarah answered with confidence and supporting data. "What about production timelines?" he asked finally. "Retooling for this design would delay the V7 launch by how long?" 6 weeks, Sarah admitted. "But the result would be a product that outperforms our original design while better aligning with Authentica's sustainability standards." Anthony turned to me. "Is a 6-week delay acceptable from your perspective? If the result is a significantly better product that better represents where we're heading as a company?" "Absolutely." He nodded slowly, still examining the prototype. "We'd need to run comprehensive field tests on the new materials. Lab results are promising, but real-world conditions are less predictable." "Of course," I agreed. "We wouldn't proceed without thorough testing." "And the marketing angle would need to shift," he continued, thinking aloud. "We've been positioning the V7 as the fastest sensor array in its class. This redesign trades pure speed for efficiency and longevity. A trade-off that many clients would actually prefer," Sarah pointed out, "especially in remote deployment scenarios where maintenance access is limited." Anthony fell silent, continuing his careful examination of the prototype. Finally, he looked up, first at Sarah, then at me. "Let's run a parallel development track. Continue with the original design to maintain our timeline, but allocate resources to fast-track this version as well. If the field tests confirm your projections, we'll pivot to sustainable design as our primary offering." It wasn't the full commitment I'd hoped for, but it was a reasonable compromise that acknowledged both the promise of Sarah's design and the risks of delaying an anticipated product launch. "Agreed," I said. "Sarah, work with Rachel to identify the resources you'll need for the parallel track." As we left the innovation lab, Sarah could barely contain her excitement. "This is just the beginning," she said. "I have so many ideas for how we can redesign other products in our pipeline to be more sustainable without sacrificing performance." "Want to hear all of them?" I told her sincerely. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that will make the integration successful." She hesitated, then added, "Not everyone is as open to these changes as I am. Some of the engineering team is worried that sustainability requirements will limit their creative freedom." "Change always creates anxiety," I acknowledged, "but I'm not interested in imposing arbitrary restrictions. What I want is for sustainability to become part of the creative process from the beginning, not an afterthought or a marketing gimmick." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Maybe we should organize some kind of workshop where your Authentica team could share case studies of how this has worked with other acquisitions. Seeing real examples might help ease some of the concerns." "That's an excellent idea. Work with Rebecca to set it up for next week." As Sarah headed off to continue her work, I reflected on how quickly she had embraced not just the changes themselves, but the underlying philosophy behind them. In just 1 week, she had moved from enthusiastic support to active advocacy, bringing others along with her vision. If only all transitions could be this smooth. But I knew from experience that the real challenges often emerged after the initial excitement faded. When difficult decisions had to be made, when habits proved harder to change than anticipated, when competing priorities created inevitable tensions. And then there was Ethan, the wild card in this integration. His apparent adaptation was encouraging but uncertain. Only time would tell whether his new embrace of Authentica's values was genuine evolution or simply a strategic repositioning of his own personal brand. The real test would come at the Green Innovation Summit, where we would both step onto a public stage and present our vision for the future, not just of our companies, but of the relationship between technology, sustainability, and authentic business practices. As I headed back to my office, my phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Don't forget, dinner with the Luminous Crafts team tonight at Terra Plata, 7 p.m. I smiled, realizing I'd nearly forgotten this long-planned gathering with the small team that still ran the candle company where my journey had begun In the whirlwind of the acquisition, it would be grounding to reconnect with those roots, to remember that empires can indeed start with something as simple as handmade candles sold at a farmer's market. And perhaps that was the message I needed, to convey not just to Vertex's employees, but to Ethan specifically. That dismissing small beginnings often means missing the seeds of something truly significant. That authentic growth, while sometimes slower, builds foundations that can support structures far greater than those built on hype and disruption alone. The Seattle afternoon light filtered through my office windows, casting long shadows across the floor. In just 1 week, I'd begun to reshape Vertex, but the more meaningful work still lay ahead. Not just changing processes and products, but changing mindsets, including, perhaps, Ethan's Terra Plata's rooftop garden was in full bloom, creating an oasis of greenery above the bustling Pike Place neighborhood. Herbs and edible flowers surrounded the outdoor dining area, many of which would find their way into the evening's farm-to-table dishes. It was the perfect setting for my reunion dinner with the original Luminous Crafts team. "There she is," called Mia Rodriguez, spotting me as I emerged onto the rooftop. The candle maker turned into a corporate titan. Mia had been my first employee at Luminous, joining when we barely had enough revenue to pay her part-time salary. Now she was the company's general manager, overseeing operations that had grown tenfold since those early days. Around the table sat the core team that had helped build Luminous Crafts: Mia, Daniel Chen, our product development specialist, and no relation to Sarah, Zoe Washington, who managed our sustainable sourcing, and Tara Bennett, owner of the Daily Grind coffee shop, who had given us our first real office space and remained one of our closest retail partners. I hugged each of them in turn, realizing how much I'd missed their energy and camaraderie amid the corporate formality of Vertex. "So," Zoe asked as we settled in with glasses of Washington Pinot Noir, "how does it feel to be running a tech company? Do they even know what sustainability means over there?" "They're learning," I replied with a smile. "Some are faster than others. I still can't believe Mr. Harvard MBA himself now works for you," Daniel chuckled. "You should have seen his face when he came into our booth at that trade show 3 years ago. Looked at our hand-poured candles like they were some quaint artifact from a bygone era." I remembered that encounter well. Ethan had been attending the Sustainable Products Expo not out of interest in sustainability, but because Vertex had been scouting potential clients for their sensor technology. He'd stopped by the Luminous Crafts booth, clearly not recognizing me initially, and had made several condescending remarks about charming little businesses, before suddenly realizing who I was. "Has he figured out yet that all those mystery acquisitions he's been reading about in the business press were actually you?" Tara asked. "He knows now," I confirmed, though I think he's still processing the implications. "I would pay good money to have seen his face when he found out," Mia laughed. "It was certainly a moment," I acknowledged, "but strangely he's adapting better than I expected. Almost too well, in fact." "Suspicious," Zoe declared, never one to mince words. "Men like that don't change their worldview overnight. He's playing the long game." "Maybe," I conceded. "But even if he's just going through the motions for now, he's smart enough to see that Authentica's approach works. Results have a way of changing minds over time." "Speaking of results," Daniel interjected, "the new botanical fragrance line is performing, 28% above projections. Turns out your instinct about seasonal rotation was spot on." For the next hour, we discussed Luminous Crafts business, the new product lines, expanded distribution channels, and upcoming sustainability initiatives. Despite the acquisition of Vertex dominating my attention recently, I remained deeply invested in the company where my journey had begun. "You still haven't told us the whole story," Tara said as our main courses arrived. "What's it really been like, taking over Ethan's company after all those years of him looking down on what we do?" I took a sip of wine, considering my answer. "Honestly, it's been educational. For both of us, I think. I'm learning about running a technology company, and he's learning that maybe handcrafted products and sustainable business practices weren't such small thinking after all. And the other executives? How are they handling the transition? Daniel asked. Mixed reactions. The CFO is cautiously analytical. The CTO is pragmatically interested. And the director of product development is enthusiastically on board. Most employees are still in wait-and-see mode, which is natural during any acquisition. And no one suspected anything beforehand? Even with Jason Reynolds meeting with you regularly? Mia wondered. Authentica's privacy protocols are quite effective, I explained. All acquisitions are handled through layers of legal entities. Most people at Vertex thought Jason was exploring investment opportunities, not selling the company. Clever, Zoe approved. Stealth mode business development, just like how we started, under the radar, building something meaningful while others were making noise. As dinner progressed, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't since before. The acquisition. These were people who had known me when Luminous Crafts operated out of my apartment kitchen, who had believed in the vision when it was just that. A vision, not yet a reality. With them, I didn't need to be CEO Emily Hartwell. I could just be Emily, who loved creating beautiful, sustainable products that brought joy to people's lives. By the time dessert arrived, a seasonal berry galette with honey lavender ice cream, the conversation had shifted to personal updates. Daniel was taking sailing lessons. Zoe had started volunteering at an urban garden program for disadvantaged youth. Mia was considering buying her first home. Tara was expanding the daily grind to a second location. What about you, Emily? Tara asked. All work and no play can't be healthy, even for someone as driven as you. I row on Lake Union when I can, I said. And I'm still part of that book club, though I've missed the last 2 meetings. That's not enough, Mia declared. You need actual fun in your life, especially now that you're running an even bigger company. Agreed, Zoe chimed in. All this business success means nothing if you don't make time to enjoy it. They were right, of course. In building Authentica and now, integrating Vertex, I'd let my personal life shrink to almost nothing. It was a pattern I'd fallen into before, and had promised myself I'd avoid repeating. Point taken, I conceded. I'll work on that. After dinner, we lingered on the rooftop, watching as the city lights came on and the Space Needle began to glow against the darkening sky. These moments of connection were precious amid the whirlwind of corporate growth and strategic maneuvering. We should do this monthly, Daniel suggested. Keep you grounded in where all this started. I nodded, realizing how much I needed exactly that. Absolutely. Same time next month, wherever Tara suggests next. As we eventually said our goodbyes, Mia hung back, waiting until the others had gone ahead. I've known you a long time, Emily, she said. Long enough to know when something's bothering you. What is it about this Ethan situation that's really getting to you? Leave it to Mia to cut straight to the heart of the matter. She'd always been perceptive about people's emotions, even when they tried to hide them. I'm not sure, I admitted. Something about his easy adaptation feels unsatisfying, I guess. After years of dismissing everything I believed in, he's suddenly on board with minimal resistance. It feels like I've been denied the reckoning I expected. Mia considered this. Maybe the reckoning isn't supposed to be a big dramatic confrontation. Maybe it's watching him gradually realize, day by day, that he's been wrong all along. That could be more powerful than any single moment of revelation. Her insight stayed with me as I headed home that evening, the lights of Seattle reflecting, off the waters of Elliott Bay. Perhaps the most meaningful victory wasn't in Ethan's immediate recognition of his misjudgment, but in the slow, inevitable realization that would come as he witnessed Authentica's principles succeeding in practice. Monday morning heralded the beginning of my 3rd week as Vertex's CEO. I arrived early, as was my habit, to review the day's agenda before the office filled with employees. Rebecca had organized a packed schedule. The engineering team workshop Sarah had suggested, a video conference with international clients concerned about the acquisition, and a review of Anthony's parallel development proposal for the V7 sensor. Array. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor, Jason Reynolds. "Jason," I greeted him, rising from my desk. "This is a surprise. I thought you were taking some time off." "I was," he confirmed, settling carefully into a chair. His walking stick, I noticed, had been replaced by a more substantial cane, suggesting his health challenges might be progressing. "But I've been following the integration progress and I wanted to check in personally." "How are you feeling?" I asked, genuine concern in my voice. "Good days and bad," he replied with a wry smile. "Today's one of the better ones, but I didn't come to talk about my health. I want to know how Vertex is adapting to its new parent company." I gave him an honest assessment, the encouraging signs from Sarah and parts of the engineering team, the cautious evaluation from Rachel and Anthony, the mixed reactions from middle management, and Ethan's surprisingly cooperative approach. "Ethan's playing nice?" Jason looked skeptical. "That doesn't sound like him. He fought me on every major decision for the past 2 years. "That's what makes it interesting," I agreed. "He's not just complying. He's actively integrating Authentica's language and values into his work. His new marketing proposal reads like it was written by someone who's believed in sustainable business. Practices all along." Jason's eyebrows rose. "And you don't trust it." "I'm reserving judgment. People can change, but rarely so completely or quickly." "What do you think his game is?" I considered the question. "Best case scenario? He genuinely sees the value in our approach and is smart enough to adapt quickly. Worst case? He's positioning himself to appear indispensable while gathering intelligence on our methods and strategies." "For what purpose?" "I'm not sure yet. Perhaps to start his own competing venture eventually, or to make himself attractive to a competitor who wants insight into how Authentica operates." Jason nodded slowly. "You've thought this through. What's your strategy for handling him?" "Give him enough rope," I said simply. "If his adaptation is genuine, he'll prove it through consistent actions over time. If not, he'll eventually reveal his true intentions. And meanwhile, I keep him engaged with meaningful projects that advance our goals whether his commitment is genuine or not." Jason smiled, a hint of his old vigor appearing. "Smart. You're as strategic about people as you are about business." "They're inseparable," I pointed out. "Business is fundamentally about relationships, with customers, with communities, with employees. Understanding people's motivations is as important as understanding market dynamics." "A lesson Ethan never quite grasped," Jason observed. "For all his marketing brilliance, he's always seen people as targets to be persuaded rather than partners to be engaged." We spoke for another half hour, with Jason offering insights about various key employees and relationships with important clients. His institutional knowledge was invaluable, filling in gaps that wouldn't appear in any official documentation. As he prepared to leave, he said, "I'm glad I sold to you, Emily. Vertex needed this course correction, even if not everyone realizes it yet." After Jason departed, I found myself reflecting on his assessment of Ethan, seeing people as targets rather than partners. It crystallized something I'd sensed but hadn't fully articulated: the fundamental difference in how Ethan and I approached business. For all his talk of disruption and innovation, his worldview was ultimately transactional rather than relational. The engineering workshop that afternoon provided a fascinating window into how this philosophical difference was playing out across the company. Rebecca and 2 other Authentica executives presented case studies of previous acquisitions, demonstrating how sustainability principles had enhanced rather than hindered innovation. I observed from the back of the room, watching the engineers' reactions. Some were openly enthusiastic, others skeptically attentive, and a few clearly resistant. One senior engineer, a man named Robert Martinez, who had been with Vertex since its founding, was particularly vocal with his concerns. "This all sounds good in theory," he challenged during the Q&A, "but engineering is about practical constraints. Adding sustainability requirements just adds another layer of limitations to work around. Or another dimension to innovate within," countered Rebecca. "Constraints often drive the most creative solutions. When the Apollo 13 engineers had to make a square filter work in a round hole using only materials available on the spacecraft, they produced one of history's greatest feats of innovative problem-solving." I noticed Ethan slip into the room during this exchange, standing against the wall and observing with arms crossed. His expression was thoughtful rather than defensive, another departure from what Jason had described as his typical response to new ideas. After the workshop, as engineers broke into smaller discussion groups, Ethan approached me. "Interesting approach," he commented. "Leading with success stories rather than mandates." "People respond better to inspiration than instruction," I replied, "especially creative professionals like engineers." True, though Robert isn't entirely wrong. Sustainability parameters do add constraints to the design process. All design happens within constraints, I pointed out. Budget, timeline, market. Requirements, technical limitations. These are all constraints engineers work with daily. Sustainability is just another parameter, and ultimately, a competitive advantage when done right. Ethan nodded, seeming to genuinely consider this perspective. "Your team presents a compelling case. The solar charging system integration for the forestry monitoring project was particularly impressive." The project he referenced had been one of Authentica's first ventures into technology-adjacent products, a partnership with a sustainable forestry company to develop solar-powered monitoring stations made from biodegradable materials. "That project almost failed," I told him, sharing something few outside Authentica knew. "The first prototype was a complete disaster. The biodegradable housing deteriorated too quickly in humid conditions. We had to completely reimagine the approach. But you stuck with it rather than reverting to traditional materials, because the goal mattered enough to justify the additional effort. Sometimes persistence through failure is what leads to the most significant innovations." Ethan was quiet for a moment, watching the engineers in their discussion groups. "I've revised my summit presentation," he said finally. "I'd appreciate your feedback when you have time. Send it to me this afternoon. I'll review it tonight." As he turned to leave, I added, "By the way, Jason stopped by this morning. He mentioned that you two frequently disagreed on strategic decisions." Ethan paused. "Jason is brilliant, but cautious. I pushed for faster growth, more aggressive market positioning. And now? Still think that was the right approach?" He met my eyes directly. "I think balanced growth is more sustainable in the long run. But I still believe in bold marketing. The message can be authentic without being timid." It was an interesting distinction, acknowledging the value of sustainable growth while maintaining his belief in assertive marketing. Perhaps this represented the beginnings of a genuine evolution in his thinking rather than a mere strategic adaptation. Later that day, Ethan's revised summit presentation arrived in my inbox. I opened it after dinner, curled up on my sofa with Fitzgerald purring beside me, curious to see how he'd reimagined his approach to marketing in the context of sustainability. The presentation was thorough and thoughtful, presenting a framework for what Ethan called authentic impact marketing, an approach that emphasized transparency, sustainability, and genuine relationship building while still maintaining the attention-grabbing creativity that had been his hallmark. What surprised me most was that it wasn't just a surface-level rebranding of his usual tactics. He had deeply engaged with Authentica's philosophy, finding ways to integrate it with his marketing expertise to create something that honored both. I sent him a brief email. "Strong framework. Especially appreciate the section on metrics beyond. Traditional ROI. Let's discuss further tomorrow." The following morning, I found Sarah waiting outside my office when I arrived. "I have incredible news," she announced as soon as I invited her in. The field tests for the redesigned V7 sensor came back even better than our projections. Energy efficiency is 19% higher than the original design, and the biodegradable components are showing excellent durability even in challenging conditions. "That's fantastic," I said. "Have you shared this with Anthony?" "Yes, and that's the even better part. He's recommending we abandon the original design track entirely and focus exclusively on the sustainable version. He says, and I quote, 'The performance advantages make this a straightforward business decision, regardless of sustainability considerations.'" I couldn't help smiling at that framing. For someone like Anthony, technical performance was the ultimate arbiter, and if sustainability enhanced rather than compromised that performance, his support would follow naturally. "This is exactly the kind of win we need," I told her. "Sustainable design proving itself superior on traditional metrics, not just ethical ones." "There's more," Sarah continued, barely containing her excitement. "Robert Martinez, the skeptical engineer from yesterday's workshop, he's asked to join the redesign team. He says he wants to see firsthand how we're achieving these results." This was significant progress. Robert had been one of the most vocal critics of the sustainability focus, and his interest in the redesign project suggested a potential shift. In his perspective, "Keep me updated on his involvement," I requested. "Converting skeptics into advocates is how cultural change happens." After Sarah left, I reviewed the agenda for my upcoming meeting with Ethan to discuss his summit presentation. This interaction felt particularly important. Perhaps the first real test of whether his apparent adaptation to Authentica's philosophy was genuine or merely strategic. The Ethan Morgan I'd known in business school would have resented any suggestion that his approach to business needed correction. Ethan, who had mocked my small thinking at industry events, would have bristled at adapting his presentation to align with sustainability principles. But this new Ethan, the one who had created a thoughtful framework integrating authentic marketing with measurable impact, seemed to be evolving into someone different. Or was he? The question lingered as I prepared for our meeting. Was I witnessing genuine growth, or merely the chameleon-like adaptation of a career-focused executive recognizing which way the wind was blowing? The answer mattered not just for Ethan's future at Vertex, but for the success of the integration as a whole. As a key executive with significant influence, his authentic buy-in could accelerate the cultural transformation. His resistant compliance would hinder it, and his strategic deception could potentially undermine it. Outside my office window, Seattle was emerging from its morning fog, the Space Needle gradually becoming visible as the mist receded. Like the clearing view, the truth about Ethan's transformation would eventually become apparent, not through his words or even his carefully crafted presentations, but through his actions over time. The Green Innovation Summit was still 3 weeks away. Between now and then, countless decisions, interactions, and moments of truth would reveal whether Ethan Morgan was truly embracing the principles he had once dismissed, or simply playing a sophisticated role to protect his position and advance his career. Either way, the irony remained. The man who had mocked my small thinking was now adapting to the very philosophy that had grown my little candle business into a company powerful enough to acquire his. The Green Innovation Summit had transformed San Francisco's Presidio into a showcase of sustainable technology and ethical business practices. Pavilions displaying everything from biodegradable electronics to carbon-negative building materials dotted the grounds, while conference rooms hosted discussions on renewable energy, circular economy principles, and responsible investment. 3. Weeks had passed since my conversation with Ethan about his presentation, and in that time, Vertex's integration into Authentica had progressed steadily. The sustainable redesign of the V7 sensor array had moved from prototype to production planning, with Anthony Wilson becoming an unexpected champion of the new approach. Rachel Patel had restructured the financial forecasts to prioritize long-term resilience over quarterly performance. Even Robert Martinez, the skeptical engineer, had begun contributing valuable insights to sustainability initiatives. As for Ethan, his behavior had remained consistent, professionally engaged, increasingly fluent in Authentica's philosophy, and outwardly supportive of the new direction. Yet something in his manner still gave me pause. There was a watchfulness in his interactions, a careful calculation that suggested he was still navigating this new landscape rather than truly embracing it. Now, standing backstage at the summit's main venue, I reviewed my keynote notes one last time. The presentation would formally introduce Vertex as part of Authentica brands to the sustainability community, a significant moment in our integration journey. 5 minutes, Ms. Hartwell, a staff member informed me. I nodded, taking a deep breath. Public speaking had never been my favorite activity, but over the years, I'd learned to channel my nervous energy into focused presence. Nervous? Asked a familiar voice. I turned to find Ethan approaching, dressed in a tailored suit that somehow managed to look both professional and relaxed, perfectly calibrated for the summit's blend of corporate and sustainability cultures. Focused, I corrected with a slight smile. You're on after the lunch break, right? Yes. Smaller venue, but they're expecting a full house according to the organizers. He hesitated, then added, I wanted to thank you. For what? Pushing me to rethink my presentation. The process has been educational. Before I could respond, the summit director appeared. We're ready for you, Ms. Hartwell. Mr. Morgan, your technical check is scheduled for 11:30. As I moved toward the stage, Ethan called after me, Knock 'em dead, Emily. The main hall was packed with sustainability professionals, tech industry leaders, investors, and media representatives. Stepping onto the stage, I felt the weight of the moment, not just as CEO of Authentica and Vertex, but as someone whose journey from small business owner to industry leader embodied the summit's central theme, that responsible, sustainable practices could create substantial business success. Good morning, I began, the spotlight warming my face. My name is Emily Hartwell, and my business journey began with handmade soy candles sold at a farmer's market. Over the next 40 minutes, I shared Authentica's evolution from luminous crafts to a multi-company organization, emphasizing how our commitment to sustainability had driven innovation rather than hindered it. I detailed the Vertex acquisition as a natural expansion of our mission, demonstrating how sensor technology could advance environmental monitoring, sustainable agriculture, and energy optimization. The old narrative pits business success against ethical practices, I concluded. It suggests we must choose between profitability and responsibility. At Authentica, we've proven that this is a false choice. When we build businesses with integrity, sustainability, and authentic human connection at their core, we create something that can grow not just bigger, but better, stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more successful by every measure that truly matters. The applause was gratifying, but even more meaningful were the engaged questions that followed. These weren't just polite inquiries, but substantive explorations of how our approach could be applied across different industries and scales. After the keynote, I spent an hour in the networking lounge, speaking with potential partners, curious competitors, and sustainability journalists. The response to Authentica's acquisition of Vertex was overwhelmingly positive, with many seeing it as a bold move that bridged the gap between technological innovation and sustainable business practices. I was speaking with an investment group, interested in Authentica's approach when I noticed Ethan across the room, deep in conversation with Caroline Winters, CEO of Meridian Technologies, one of Vertex's main competitors. Their body language suggested an intense discussion, with Caroline taking notes on her tablet as Ethan spoke animatedly. "Excuse me," I said to the investors. There's someone I need to check in with. By the time I made my way across the crowded lounge, Ethan and Caroline had moved to a quieter corner. I approached casually, catching just a fragment of their conversation. Completely transformed their approach to market positioning, Ethan was saying. The results have been... He broke off, noticing me. Emily, perfect timing. I was just telling Caroline about our successful product redesign. Caroline extended her hand. Emily Hartwell, your keynote was impressive. Ethan has been explaining how you've integrated sustainability principles into Vertex's development process without sacrificing performance. It's been a collaborative effort, I replied, studying both their expressions. Ethan has been instrumental in reshaping our marketing approach to authentically communicate the value proposition. So I've been hearing, Caroline said with an appraising look. In fact, I'd love to continue this conversation. Perhaps dinner this evening? Both of you, if you're available. Unfortunately, I have a prior commitment, I said, but I'm sure Ethan can provide additional insights. After confirming dinner plans, Caroline excused herself to attend a panel discussion, leaving Ethan and me alone in the corner. Interesting conversation, I observed neutrally. Caroline's been watching the Vertex acquisition closely, Ethan explained. She's curious about our integration process. I'm sure she is. Meridian would love to know exactly how we're restructuring our operations. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. I'm not revealing anything proprietary, Emily. Just general approaches that are already public knowledge after your keynote. And dinner tonight? Will that also stick to public knowledge? A flicker of something, annoyance, defensiveness, crossed his face. Do you trust me so little? Trust is earned over time, Ethan. Especially when someone has spent years dismissing everything I believe in, then suddenly becomes its advocate after I become their boss. He was quiet for a moment, his practiced poise momentarily disrupted. Fair point. But people can change their perspectives when presented with compelling evidence. They can, I agreed. The question is whether you have. Before he could respond, my phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. Sarah's presentation starting in 5-man Redwood Room. I need to go, I told him. Sarah's about to present our sustainable sensor redesign. I'll walk with you, he said. My session's not for another 2 hours. As we navigated through the summit crowds, Ethan said, I'll cancel with Caroline if it concerns you. That's not necessary, I replied. Just be thoughtful about what you share. Meridian isn't just a curious observer. They're an active competitor evaluating how our changes might affect their market position. I understand competitive dynamics, Emily, he said, a hint of his old arrogance surfacing. I've been navigating them successfully for years. Yes, but now you're doing it as part of Authentica, where we value collaborative relationships over competitive dominance. Different philosophy, different approach. Sarah's presentation was already underway when we slipped into the Redwood Room. She stood confidently at the podium, displaying detailed schematics of the redesigned V7 sensor array to an engaged audience of engineers, sustainability professionals, and potential clients. The key innovation isn't just the biodegradable housing, she was explaining, but the modular architecture that allows components to be easily replaced or upgraded, extending the product lifecycle by an estimated 300% compared to sealed units. I noticed Anthony Wilson sitting in the front row, nodding approvingly as Sarah detailed the technical specifications. Beside him sat Robert Martinez, the formerly skeptical engineer, taking detailed notes. She's impressive, Ethan murmured. You were smart to identify her potential early. Sarah had these ideas long before the acquisition, I corrected him. She just needed an environment where they would be valued rather than dismissed as impractical idealism. The presentation concluded with compelling performance data showing how the sustainable redesign actually outperformed the original version on multiple metrics. The audience response was enthusiastic, with several potential clients requesting follow-up meetings to discuss implementation in their own operations. As the room cleared for the next session, Sarah approached us, face flushed with success. "That was fantastic," I told her warmly. "You conveyed both the technical excellence and the ethical imperative perfectly." "Thanks," she beamed. "The best part is how many traditional tech companies are showing interest. We're proving that sustainability can be a competitive advantage, not just a moral choice." "Speaking of which," Ethan interjected, "I should prepare for my session. Emily, will you be attending?" "Wouldn't miss it," I assured him, curious to see how his presentation had evolved since I'd reviewed the initial draft. The afternoon unfolded with a series of breakout sessions focusing on different aspects of sustainable innovation. I attended several, networking with industry leaders and potential partners between presentations. Throughout it all, I found myself anticipating Ethan's session with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. When the time finally came, I slipped into the back of the cedar room just as Ethan was being introduced. The space was indeed full, with attendees standing along the walls after all seats had been taken. "Good afternoon," Ethan began, his confident presence immediately commanding attention. 3 months ago, if you had told me I'd be standing here speaking about authentic marketing and sustainability, I would have been skeptical, to say the least. A knowing chuckle rippled through the audience. My background is in what we might call disruption marketing, aggressive positioning, competitive dominance, rapid market capture. I believed quite firmly that this was the only approach that made sense in today's fast-paced technology sector. He paused, scanning the room. I was wrong. The simple admission hung in the air, creating an immediate connection with the audience through its unexpected vulnerability. What I've learned through Vertex's acquisition by Authentica Brands is that authenticity isn't just a marketing buzzword. It's a fundamentally different approach to business that creates deeper connections, more resilient growth, and ultimately, more meaningful success. As Ethan continued, I was struck by the genuine conviction in his delivery. This wasn't the calculated performance I had expected, but something that felt surprisingly authentic, as if he were processing his own transformation, even as he articulated. He outlined the framework we had discussed, authentic impact marketing, but embellished it with personal insights and real examples from Vertex's ongoing integration experience. He acknowledged mistakes he'd made in the past, emphasizing how focus on short-term metrics had sometimes undermined long-term value creation. "The most powerful lesson I've learned," he said toward the end, "is that small, thoughtful beginnings often create stronger foundations than flashy, rapid growth." Some of you may have heard Emily Hartwell's keynote this morning, where she mentioned starting with handmade candles at a farmer's market. What she didn't mention is that I once mocked that very business as small thinking. My breath caught. He hadn't included this in the draft I'd reviewed. "I couldn't have been more wrong," Ethan continued. "While I was chasing the next big disruption, Emily was building something with integrity, sustainability, and genuine human connection at its core. Her small thinking created the foundation for a company strong enough to ultimately acquire the very business I had touted as the epitome of innovative success." The room was completely silent now, every person captivated by this unexpected confession. The humility to recognize when we're wrong, to learn from those we may have dismissed, to evolve our thinking in the face of compelling evidence, these are strengths, not weaknesses. They're the hallmarks of truly innovative thinking. As Ethan concluded his presentation, the audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for the content, which was compelling, but for the authentic transformation it represented. I remained in my seat, trying to process what I had just witnessed. This wasn't the strategic adaptation I had suspected, but something more profound. A genuine reconsideration of principles and priorities that had guided his entire career. When the applause finally subsided and the Q&A began, I slipped out of the room, needing a moment alone to gather my thoughts. I found a quiet spot in the summit's sustainable garden installation, sitting on a bench surrounded by native plants and the gentle sound of a recirculating water feature. My phone buzzed, with a message from Rebecca. Ethan's session getting rave reviews online. What happened there? I didn't respond immediately, still processing the implications. If Ethan's transformation was genuine, and his unprompted public acknowledgement of his past dismissiveness suggested it might be, then the integration of Vertex into Authentica had catalyzed something more significant than a mere corporate restructuring. After the summit's formal programming concluded for the day, attendees gathered for a reception featuring sustainable wines and locally sourced hors d'oeuvre. I was speaking with a group of clean energy investors when Ethan approached, still riding the wave of positive response to his presentation. "Got a minute?" he asked. We moved to a quieter corner of the reception area, crystal glasses of organic, Washington State wine in hand. "That wasn't in your draft," I said directly. "The part about mocking my business." "No, it wasn't," he acknowledged. "It was a last-minute addition. Or maybe not so last minute. I've been thinking about it for weeks, trying to find the right way to address our history. Why address it at all? Especially so publicly?" Ethan looked down at his wine glass, turning it slowly in his hands. "Authenticity requires honesty, doesn't it? About where we've been wrong, how we've grown, what we've learned." It felt hypocritical to stand there talking about authentic marketing without acknowledging my own most significant shift in perspective. I studied him, searching for signs of the calculated performance I'd suspected. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: genuine reflection. "These past 3 weeks working with your team, with our team," he corrected himself, "have changed how I think about business fundamentally. Seeing the results of the V7 redesign, watching how Sarah's ideas flourished when given the right environment, experiencing how different Authentica's approach to client relationships is from what I've practiced throughout my career. It's been revelatory." "And dinner with Caroline Winters?" I asked. "Still planning to go?" "I canceled," he said simply. "You were right. Different philosophy, different approach. Meridian isn't a potential collaborator. They're looking for competitive intelligence. That's not how Authentica operates." The summit continued for 2 more days, with Authentica and Vertex together emerging as one of the event's most discussed success stories. Our integrated team, Sarah, Anthony, Rachel, Ethan, and others, presented a unified vision of technology in service of sustainability, generating significant interest from potential clients and partners. On the final evening, as the summit wound down, I found myself once again in the sustainable garden installation, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. From handmade candles sold at Pike Place Market to leading a company that was now being hailed as a model for the future of ethical business, the path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had been true to my values at every step. "Mind some company?" Ethan asked, appearing on the garden path. I gestured to the empty space beside me on the bench, and he sat down, loosening his tie as he did so. "Quite a 3 days," he observed, looking out over the colorful native plantings. "Productive," I agreed. "I think we've positioned Vertex effectively within the sustainability community. And within the broader technology sector," he added. 3 potential clients approached me today specifically because of our sustainable redesign initiative. They see it as innovation leadership, not just ethical positioning. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees surrounding the garden. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said finally. "A real one, not just a public acknowledgement for strategic purposes." I turned to look at him directly. "I dismissed you and your business approach for years," he continued. "Not just at that gala or during business school, but consistently, whenever your name came up in industry conversations. I was so convinced that my way, fast growth, aggressive marketing, disruptive positioning, was the only valid approach that I couldn't see the value in what you were building. And now? I prompted. Now I see that you were right all along. Not just about business, but about what matters. Building something meaningful. Something that contributes positively rather than just grows rapidly. Creating authentic connections, instead of just strategic advantage. He shook his head, a rueful smile playing at his lips. The irony is that your approach, which I dismissed as too small and too slow, created something substantial enough to acquire the company I thought was changing the world. That's humbling. Humility is underrated in business, I observed. So is patience and authentic connection. All the lessons I'm still learning, he admitted. But I am learning them, Emily. This isn't just professional adaptation, it's personal revelation. I believed him. Something had shifted in Ethan. Not completely, not perfectly, but genuinely. The transformation I had doubted was actually occurring, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the steady influence of seeing a different approach succeed in practice. So where do we go from here? He asked. Professionally, I mean. That depends on you, I told him honestly. There's a place for your talents at Authentica Vertex if you truly embrace our philosophy. Not just in words or presentations, but in daily decisions and interactions. And if I continue to evolve in that direction, then you could play a significant role in helping other organizations make similar transitions. The expertise you're developing now, bridging traditional tech marketing with authentic, sustainable positioning, is valuable and rare. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I'd like that. To help other companies navigate what I've experienced. The shift from short-term thinking to lasting impact. As we walked back toward the summit's closing reception, I reflected on the unexpected journey of the past month. I had acquired Vertex expecting to prove Ethan wrong, to force him to acknowledge the value of what he had dismissed. Instead, something more meaningful had emerged. Not just acknowledgement, but understanding. Not just professional compliance, but personal growth. The Seattle skyline welcomed us home the following day, the Space Needle standing tall against the clear autumn sky as our plane descended. Looking down at the city where my business journey had begun, from a small apartment kitchen to the farmer's market to the coffee shop office, I felt a profound sense of completion. The man who had mocked my small business was now not just my employee, but a genuine advocate for the principles that had guided that business from the beginning. The victory wasn't in humiliating him or forcing his compliance. It was in witnessing his genuine recognition of a better way forward. As we disembarked, Ethan said, "You know, I've been thinking about that first office you had above the daily grind. Maybe we should have our next marketing strategy session there, to remind us of the value of thoughtful beginnings." I smiled. I think that's an excellent idea. Sometimes the most satisfying victories aren't the ones where you defeat your opponent, but the ones where they voluntarily join your side. Not because you've conquered them, but because you've convinced them through consistent demonstration of a better way. The small business he had mocked had indeed become something powerful, not just financially, but philosophically. Powerful enough to transform not only industries but mindsets. Powerful enough to convert criticism into conviction. Powerful enough to turn mockery into genuine admiration. And that was a victory worth every step of the journey. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.